If you are given one trig function and asked to find the others, it is a simple task that only requires knowing which quadrant you are in and the Pythagorean theorem. So we're going to find the values of all the trig functions given the following information. We know that sine t equals 3/5 and we are in quadrant 1. So we know what quadrant we're in, but we're going to use the Pythagorean theorem to draw a right triangle to figure out all the values of that right triangle. So let's start off with drawing a right triangle. And we're going to fill in our values. So we know that sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So this here is our t value. This is the angle. So we know that the opposite is over here, so 3. And the hypotenuse is always the longest side, so this is 5. So we still got to find the adjacent side here. And we can do that by using the Pythagorean theorem. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And so a squared is 3 squared, so that's going to be 9. Trying to find b squared, and c squared is the hypotenuse squared, so 5 squared is 25. So we're going to subtract 9 over. We're going to get 16, and then square root both sides. And normally when you take the square root of both sides, you have plus or minus. But since we're working with lengths, we can't have a negative, so we can disregard the negative and just focus on the positive. So b is 4. So now I have finished my right triangle. I know that I am in quadrant 1, and now I can figure out the rest of my trig functions. So I already know sine, it's given to me. Cosine of t is, well, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so adjacent is 4, and hypotenuse is 5, so 4/5. Next is tangent t, and tangent is opposite over adjacent, so opposite 3 over adjacent 4, so 3/4. Now once you get those 3, the rest are pretty easy. Let's do cosecant t, and that's just sine reciprocated, so it's going to be 5/3. Next we can do secant t, and that's just cosine reciprocated, so that's going to be 5/4. And then last is cotangent t, and that's just tangent reciprocated, so that's 4/3. And there's all my trig functions for this problem. Make sure once you're done, double check your quadrant and that you haven't gotten the signs incorrect. Since we're in quadrant 1, all of these are positive, so we're good here. Next, we have cosine equaling -4/5, and sine, well, it's negative, but it doesn't tell us the quadrant. But from this information, we can figure out the quadrant. So we know from this information, cosine is negative. Well, cosine is only negative in quadrants 3 and 2. And we know that sine is only negative in quadrants 3 and 4. So just from this information here, I can see that we are in quadrant 3. Now that I know we're in quadrant 3, I still got to make my right triangle. So right triangle, x, and we got cosine. Again, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, so 4 and 5. And then we can use the Pythagorean theorem again to find the opposite side, or if you remember, we had a right triangle already, it had 4 and 5 there, we're going to have a 3 here. So this is one of those nice ones where if your sides, your opposite and adjacent sides are 3, 4, your hypotenuse is 5. So this is a nice one we don't have to do too much work for. So we got our triangle, we got our quadrant, so now we can fill out the rest of the trig functions. So going to do sine x, and sine is opposite over hypotenuse, so 3 over 5. But again, we were in quadrant 3, and sine is negative here, so make sure it's a negative. Next is tangent, and tangent is opposite over adjacent, so opposite 3 over adjacent 4. It's in quadrant 3, so tangent's positive, we can leave it alone. And now that we got these three, we can get the last three very easy. So cosecant x is just going to be sine reciprocated, so negative 5/3. Secant x is just cosine reciprocated, so negative 5/4. And then cotangent is just tangent reciprocated, so 4/3. And it's positive because we're in quadrant 3. So again, we're in quadrant 3, so cosine, sine, cosecant, and secant should be negative. Tangent and cotangent should be positive. So there are those trig functions. Last, tangent t is negative 4 and cosecant is 0. So again, we need to know what quadrant we are in. So let's start off with tangent is negative. So if tangent is negative, that would mean either quadrants 2 or 4. And if cosecant is positive, that means either 2 or 1. So the overlap here is in quadrant 2. So we are in quadrant 2. Now we still got to draw a right triangle. Now this one's not going to be one of the nice ones, but that's okay. So we know tangent is opposite over adjacent. So this is going to be negative 4 over 1. So this is just going to be 4 and 1 because lengths are always positive. Now we got to find the hypotenuse. So that's going to be 16 plus 1 equals c squared. Because that's 4 squared plus 1 squared. So we add these together, we're going to get 17 equals c squared. And then square root both sides, and we're going to get square root of 17 equals c. Again, we disregard the negative here because distances can only be positive. So our hypotenuse is square root of 17. Now that we have this, we can figure out what all of the other trig functions are. So let's start off with sine. So sine t, again, is going to be opposite over hypotenuse. So 4 over square root of 17. But if you need to rationalize it, it would be 4 root 17 over 17. Next is cosine. Cosine is just adjacent, adjacent, over hypotenuse. So adjacent over hypotenuse. So 1 over root 17. And again, we are in quadrant 2, so this is a negative. And again, if you need to rationalize the denominator, it would end up being negative root 17 over 17. Now that we have these three, we can figure out the other three quickly. So cosecant t is just sine reciprocated. So I'm going to stick with this one here, and we're going to get square root of 17 over 4. And again, quadrant 2 means it is positive because sine and cosecant are positive in quadrant 2. Next is secant t, and that's just cosine reciprocated, so that's going to be negative root 17. And then last is cotangent t, and cotangent is just tangent reciprocated, so negative 4 over 1 is going to be negative 1 over 4. And here are all the trig functions for this one.